Winston as Churchill, The World Crisis, Volume 1, Chapter 3, The Crisis of Agadir, 1911. On the idle hill of summer, sleepy with the sound of streams, far I hear the steady drummer drumming like a noise in dreams. Far and near and low and louder on the roads of earth go by, dear to friend and food for powder, soldiers marching all to die. The Shropshire Lad, 35. In the spring of 1911 a French expedition occupied Fez. This action added to the growing discontent in Germany over the Moroccan question, tempted the German government at the beginning of July to an abrupt act. The brothers Mannesmann, a German firm at that time very active in European financial circles, claimed that they had large interests in a harbour on the Atlantic seaboard of the Moroccan coast, and in the hinterland behind it. This harbour bore the name of Agadir. Herr von Kiderlen-Wächter, the German foreign minister, raised this point with the French. The French government fully realized that the advantages they were gaining in Morocco justified Germany in seeking certain colonial compensation in the Congo area. The German press, on the other hand, was indignant at exchanging German interests in the moderate climate of Morocco for unhealthy tropical regions of which they had already more than enough. The question involved were complicated and intrinsically extremely unimportant. The French prepared themselves for a prolonged negotiation. So far as the harbour and the hinterland of Agadir were concerned, there seemed to be no difficulty. They denied altogether the existence of any German interests there. They said there was only a sandy bay untouched by the hand of man. There was no German property on the shore, not a trading establishment, not a house. There were no German interests in the interior. But these facts could easily be ascertained by a visit of accredited representatives of both countries. Such a visit to ascertain the facts they professed themselves quite ready to arrange. They also courted a discussion of the frontier of the Congo territories. Suddenly and unexpectedly, on the morning of July 1st, without more ado, it was announced that His Imperial Majesty, the German Emperor, had sent his gunboat Panther to Agadir to maintain and protect German interests. This small ship was already on its way. All the alarm bells throughout Europe began immediately to quiver. France found herself in the presence of an act which could not be explained, the purpose behind which could not be measured. Great Britain, having consulted the Atlas, began to wonder what bearing a German naval base on the Atlantic coast of Africa would have upon her maritime security, observing, as the sailors say when they have to write official letters to each other, that such a fact must be taken in conjunction with German activities at Madeira and in the Canaries, and with the food routes and trade routes from South America and South Africa, which converged and passed through these waters. Europe was uneasy. France was genuinely alarmed. When Count Metternich apprised Sir Edward Grey on the German action, he was informed that the situation was so important that it must be considered by the Cabinet. On July 5, after the Cabinet, he was told that the British government could not disinterest themselves in Morocco, and that until Germany's intentions were made known, their attitude must remain one of reserve. From that date until July 21, not one word was spoken by the German government. There is no doubt that the decided posture of Great Britain was a great surprise to the German Foreign Office. There ensued between the governments what was called at the time the period of silence. Meanwhile, the French and the German newspapers carried on a lively controversy, and the British press wore a very sombre air. It was difficult to divine from the long strings of telegrams which day after day flowed in from all the European chancelleries what was the real purpose behind the German action. I followed attentively the repeated discussions on the subject in the British cabinet. Was Germany looking for a pretext of war with France, or was she merely trying by pressure and uncertainty to improve her colonial position? In the latter case, the dispute would no doubt be adjusted after a period of tension, as so many had been before. The great powers marshalled on either side, preceded and protected by an elaborate cushion of diplomatic courtesies and formalities, would display to each other their respective arrays. In the forefront would be the two principal disputants, Germany and France. And, echeloned back in either side at varying distances and under veils of reserves and qualifications of different density, would be drawn up the other parties of the Triple Alliance and to what was already now beginning to be called the Triple Entente. At the proper moment these seconds or supporters would utter certain cryptic words indicative of their state of mind, as a consequence of which France or Germany would step back or forward a very small distance, or perhaps move slightly to the right or to the left. When these delicate rectifications in the great balance of Europe, and indeed of the world, had been made, the formidable assembly would withdraw to their own apartments with ceremony and salutations, and congratulate or condole with each other in whispers on the result. We had seen it several times before. But even this process was not free from danger. One must think of the intercourse of the nations in those days not as if they were chessmen on the board, or puppets dressed in finery and frillings grimacing at each other in a quadrille, but as prodigious organizations of forces, active or latent, which, like planetary bodies, could not approach each other in space without giving rise to profound magnetic reactions. If they go too near, the lightnings would begin to flash, and beyond a certain point they might be attracted altogether from the orbits in which they were restrained and draw each other into dire collision. The task of diplomacy was to prevent such disasters, and as long as there was no conscious or subconscious purpose of war in the mind of any power or race, diplomacy would probably succeed. But in such grave and delicate conjunctions one violent move by any party would rupture and derange the restraints upon all, and plunge cosmos into chaos. I thought myself that the Germans had a certain grievance about the original Anglo-French agreement. We had received many conveniences in Egypt. France had gained great advantages in Morocco. If Germany felt her relative position prejudiced by these arrangements, there was no reason why patiently and amicably she should not advance and press her own point of view. And it seemed to me that Britain, the most withdrawn, the least committed of the great powers, might exercise a mitigating and a modifying influence, and procure an accommodation. And that, of course, was what we tried to do. But if Germany's intention were malignant, no such process would be of the slightest use. In that event, a very decided word would have to be spoken, and spoken before it was too late. Nor would our withdrawing altogether from the scene have helped matters. Had we done so, all our restraining influence would have vanished, and an intenser aggravation of the antagonistic forces must have occurred. Therefore I read all the papers and telegrams which began to pass with a suspicion, and I could see beneath the calm of Sir Edward Grey a growing, and at some moments a grave anxiety. The sultry obscurity of the European situation was complicated by the uncertain play of forces within our own council chamber. There again in miniature were reproduced the balances and reserves of the external diplomatic situation. The ministers, who were conducting the foreign policy of Britain with the ponderous trident of sea power towering up behind them, were drawn entirely from the liberal imperialist section of the government. They were narrowly watched and kept in equipoise by the radical element, which included the venerable figures of Lord Morley and Lord Loreburn, on whose side the Chancellor of the Exchequer and I had usually leaned. It was clear that this equipoise might easily make it impossible for Great Britain to speak with a decided voice either on one side or the other if certain dangerous conditions supervened. We should not therefore either keep clear ourselves by withdrawing from the danger, nor be able to resolute action to ward it off in time. In these circumstances, the attitude of the Chancellor of the Exchequer became a peculiar importance. For some weeks he offered no indication of what his line would be, and in our numerous conversations he gave me the impression of being sometimes on one side and sometimes on the other. But on the morning of July 21, when I visited him before the Cabinet, I found a different man. His mind was made up. He saw quite clearly the course to take. He knew what to do and how and when to do it. The tenor of his statement to me was that we were drifting into war. He dwelt on the oppressive silence of Germany so far as we were concerned. He pointed out that Germany was acting as if England did not count in the matter in any way, that she had completely ignored our strong representation, that she was proceeding to put the most severe pressure on France, that a catastrophe might ensue, and that if it was to be averted we must speak with great decision, and we must speak at once. He told me that he was to address the bankers at their annual dinner that evening, and that he intended to make it clear that if Germany meant war, she would find Britain against her. He showed me what he had prepared, and told me that he would show it to the Prime Minister and Sir Edward Grey after the Cabinet. What would they say? I said that of course they would be very much relieved, and so they were, and so was I. The accession of Mr. Lloyd George in foreign policy to the opposite wing of the government was decisive. We were able immediately to pursue a firm and coherent policy. That night, at the Bankers' Association, the Chancellor of the Exchequer used the following words: "I believe it is essential in the highest interests not merely of this country, but of the world, that Britain should at all hazards maintain her place and her prestige among the great powers of the world. Her potent influence has many a time been in the past, and may yet be in the future, invaluable to the cause of human liberty. It has more than once in the past redeemed continental nations, who are sometimes too apt to forget that service, from overwhelming disaster and even from national extinction. I would make great sacrifices to preserve peace. I conceive that nothing would justify a disturbance of international goodwill except questions of the gravest national moment. But if a situation were to be forced upon us in which peace could only be preserved by the surrender of the great and beneficent position Britain has won by centuries of heroism and achievement, by allowing Britain to be treated, where her interests were vitally affected, as if she were of no account in the cabinet of nations, then I say emphatically that peace at that price would be a humiliation intolerable for a great country like ours to endure." His city audience, whose minds were obsessed with the iniquities of the Lloyd George budget and the fearful hardships it had inflicted upon property and wealth, little did they dream of the future, did not comprehend in any way the significance or the importance of what they heard. They took it as if it had been one of the ordinary platitudes of ministerial pronouncements upon foreign affairs. But the chancelleries of Europe bound it together. 4 days later, at about 5:30 in the afternoon, the Chancellor of the Exchequer and I were talking by the fountains of Buckingham Palace. Hotfoot on our track came a messenger. "Will the Chancellor of the Exchequer go at once to Sir Edward Grey?" Mr. Lloyd George stopped abruptly and, turning to me, said, "That's my speech. The Germans may demand my resignation as they did Delcassé's." I said, "That will make you the most popular man in England." He was not actually the most popular at the time. We returned as fast as we could and found Sir Edward Grey in his room at the House of Commons. His first words were, "I've just received a communication from the German ambassador to Stiff that the fleet might be attacked at any moment. I've sent for McKenna to warn him." He then told us briefly of the conversation he had just had with Count Metternich. The ambassador had said that after the speech of the Chancellor of the Exchequer no explanation could be made by Germany. In accurate terms, he had stated that if France should repel the hand offered her by the Emperor's government, the dignity of Germany would compel her to secure by all means full respect by France for German treaty rights. He had then read a long complaint about Mr. Lloyd George's speech, which, to say the least, could have been interpreted as a warning to Germany's address, and which, as a matter of fact, had been interpreted by the presses of Great Britain and France as a warning bordering on menace. Sir Edward Grey had thought it right to reply that the tone of the communication, which had just been read to him, rendered it inconsistent with the dignity of His Majesty's government to give explanations with regard to the speech of the Chancellor of the Exchequer. The First Lord arrived while we were talking, and a few minutes later hurried off to send the warning orders. They sound so very cautious and correct, these deadly words. Soft, quiet voices purring, courteous, grave, exactly measured phrases in large, peaceful rooms. But with less warning, cannons had opened fire and nations had been struck down by this same Germany. So now the Admiralty wireless whispers through the ether to the tall masts of ships, and captains pace their decks absorbed in thought. It is nothing. It is less than nothing. It is too foolish, too fantastic to be thought of in the 20th century. Or is it fire and murder leaping out of the darkness at our throats, torpedoes ripping the bellies of half-awakened ships, a sunrise on a vanished naval supremacy, and an island well-guarded hitherto at last defenseless? No, it is nothing. No one would do such things. Civilization has climbed above such perils. The interdependence of nations in trade and traffic, the sense of public law, the Hague Convention, liberal principles, the Labour Party, high finance, Christian charity, common sense have rendered such nightmares impossible. Are you quite sure? It would be a pity to be wrong. Such a mistake could only be made once for all. The Mansion House speech was a surprise to all countries. It was a thunderclap to the German government. All their information had led them to believe that Mr. Lloyd George would head the peace party and that British action would be neutralized. Jumping from one extreme to another, they now assumed that the British cabinet was absolutely united, and that the Chancellor of the Exchequer, of all others, had been deliberately selected as the most radical minister by the British government to make this pronouncement. Footnote: Von Tirpitz's account on page 169 is quite direct. At his, von Kindelin-Wächter's, suggestion, the Chancellor dispatched the gunboat Panther to the Moroccan port Agadir on July 1, 1911, and left the British government, when it asked the reason, completely in the dark and without a reply for many weeks. The result was that on July 21 Lloyd George delivered a speech which had been drawn up in the British cabinet, in which he warned Germany that she would find British power on the side of France in the event of a challenge. End of footnote. They could not understand how their representatives and agents in Great Britain could have been so profoundly misled. Their vexation proved fatal to Count Metternich, and at the first convenient opportunity he was recalled. Here was an ambassador who, after 10 years' residence in London, could not even forecast the action of one of the most powerful ministers on a question of this character. It will be seen from what has been written that this view was hard on Count Metternich. How could he know what Mr. Lloyd George was going to do? Until a few hours before, his colleagues did not know. Working with him in close association, I did not know. No one knew. Until his mind was definitely made up, he did not know himself. It seems probable now that the Germans did not mean war on this occasion. But they meant to test the ground, and in so doing they were prepared to go to the very edge of the precipice. It is so easy to lose one's balance there. A touch, a gust of wind, a momentary dizziness, and all is precipitated into the abyss. But whether in the heart of the German state there was or was not a war purpose before England's part had been publicly declared, there was no such intention afterwards. After the speech of the Chancellor of the Exchequer and its sequel, the German government could not doubt that Great Britain would be against them if a war was forced upon France at this juncture. They did not immediately recede from their position, but they were most careful to avoid any fresh act of provocation, and all their further conduct of the negotiations with France tended to open in one direction or another paths of accommodation and of retreat. It remained extremely difficult for us to gauge the exact significance of the various points at issue, and throughout the months of July, August, and September the situation continued obscure and oppressive. The slight yet decisive change which came over the character of German diplomacy was scarcely perceptible, and at the same time certain precautionary military measures which were taken behind the German frontiers, so far as they were known to us, had the effect of greatly increasing our anxiety. In consequence, the atmosphere in England became constantly more heavily charged with electricity as one hot summer's day succeeded another. Hitherto, as Home Secretary, I had not had any special part to play in this affair, though I had followed it with the utmost attention as a member of the Cabinet. I was now to receive a rude shock. On the afternoon of July 27, I attended a garden party at 10 Downing Street. There I met the Chief Commissioner of Police, Sir Edward Henry. We talked about the European situation, and I told him that it was serious. He then remarked that by an odd arrangement the Home Office was responsible, through the Metropolitan Police, for guarding the magazines at Chattenden and Lodge Hill, in which all the reserves of naval cordite were stored. For many years these magazines had been protected without misadventure by a few constables. I asked what would happen if 20 determined Germans in 2 or 3 motor cars arrived, well armed, upon the scene one night. He said they would be able to do what they liked. I quitted the garden party. A few minutes later I was telephoning from my room in the Home Office to the Admiralty. Who was in charge? The First Lord was with the fleet at Cromarty. The First Sea Lord was inspecting. Both were, of course, quickly accessible by wireless or wire. In the meantime, an admiral, he shall be nameless, was in control. I demanded Marines at once to guard these magazines, vital to the Royal Navy. I knew there were plenty of Marines in the depots at Chatham and Portsmouth. The Admiral replied over the telephone that the Admiralty had no responsibility and had no intention of assuming any, and it was clear from his manner that he resented the intrusion of an alarmist civilian minister. "You refuse, then, to send the Marines?" After some hesitation he replied, "I refuse." I replaced the receiver and rang up the War Office. Mr. Haldane was there. I told him that I was reinforcing and arming the police that night, and asked for a company of infantry for each magazine in addition. In a few minutes the orders were given. In a few hours the troops had moved. By the next day the cordite reserves of the Navy were safe. The incident was a small one, and perhaps my fears were unfounded. But once one had begun to view the situation in this light, it became impossible to think of anything else. All around flowed the busy life of peaceful, unsuspecting, easy-going Britain. The streets were thronged with men and women utterly devoid of any sense of danger from abroad. For nearly 1,000 years no foreign army had landed on British soil. For 100 years the safety of the homeland had never been threatened. They went about their business, their sport, their class and party fights, year after year, generation after generation, in perfect confidence and considerable ignorance. All their ideas were derived from conditions of peace. All their arrangements were the result of long peace. Most of them would have been incredulous. Many would have been very angry if they had been told that we might be near a tremendous war, and that perhaps within this city of London, which harboured confidingly visitors from every land, resolute foreigners might be aiming a deadly blow at the strength of the one great weapon and shield in which we trusted. I began to make inquiries about vulnerable points. I found the far-seeing Captain Hankey, then Assistant Secretary to the Committee of Imperial Defence, already on the move, classifying them for the War Book, which project had actually been launched. Footnote: the work had been begun by Lieutenant Colonel Adrian Grant Duff, afterwards killed on the Aisne. End of footnote. I inquired further about sabotage and espionage and counter-espionage. I came in touch with other officers working very quietly and very earnestly, but in a small way and with small means. I was told about German spies and agents in the various British ports. Hitherto the Home Secretary had to sign a warrant when it was necessary to examine any particular letter passing through the royal mails. I now signed general warrants authorizing the examination of all the correspondence of particular people upon a list, to which additions were continually made. This soon disclosed a regular and extensive system of German-paid British agents. It was only in a very small part of the field of preparation that the Home Secretary had any official duty of interference, but once I got drawn in, it dominated all other interests in my mind. For 7 years I was to think of little else. Liberal politics, the people's budget, free trade, peace, retrenchment, and reform. all the war cries of our election struggles began to seem unreal in the presence of this new preoccupation. Only Ireland held her place among the grim realities which came one after another into view. No doubt other ministers had similar mental experiences. I am telling my own tale. I now began to make an intensive study of the military position in Europe. I read everything with which I was supplied. I spent many hours in argument and discussion. The Secretary of State for War told his officers to tell me everything I wanted to know. The Chief of the General Staff, Sir William Nicholson, was an old friend of mine. I had served with him as a young officer on Sir William Lockhart's staff at the end of the Tirah expedition in 1898. He wrote fine, broad appreciations and preached a clear and steady doctrine. But the man from whom I learned most was the Director of Military Operations, General Wilson, afterwards Field Marshal Sir Henry Wilson. This officer had extraordinary vision and faith. He had acquired an immense, and I expect an unequalled volume of knowledge about the continent. He knew the French army thoroughly. He was deeply in the secrets of the French General Staff. He had been head of the British Staff College. For years he had been laboring with one object, that if war came, we should act immediately on the side of France. He was sure that war would come sooner or later. All the threads of military information were in his hands. The whole wall of his small room was covered by a gigantic map of Belgium, across which every practicable road by which the German armies could march for the invasion of France was painted clearly. All his holidays he spent examining these roads and the surrounding country. He could not do much in Germany. The Germans knew him too well. One night the German ambassador, still Count Metternich, whom I had known for 10 years, asked me to dine with him. We were alone, and a famous hog from the Emperor's cellars was produced. We had a long talk about Germany and how she had grown great, about Napoleon and the part he had played in uniting her, about the Franco-German War and how it began and how it ended. I said what a pity it was that Bismarck had allowed himself to be forced by the soldiers into taking Lorraine, and how Alsace-Lorraine lay at the root of all the European armaments and rival combinations. He said these had been German provinces from remote antiquity until one day in profound peace Louis XIV had pranced over the frontier and seized them. I said their sympathies were French. He said they were mixed. I said that anyhow it kept the whole thing alive. France could never forget her lost provinces, and they never ceased to call to her. The conversation passed to a kindred but more critical subject. Was he anxious about the present situation? He said people were trying to ring Germany round and put her in a net, and that she was a strong animal to put in a net. I said, how could she be netted when she had an alliance with 2 other first-class powers, Austria-Hungary and Italy? We had often stood quite alone for years at a time without getting flustered. He said it was a very different business for an island. But when you had been marched through and pillaged and oppressed so often, and had only the breasts of your soldiers to stand between you and invasion, it ate into your soul. I said that Germany was frightened of nobody, and that everybody was frightened of her. Then we came to the navy. Surely, I said, it was a great mistake for Germany to try to rival Britain on the seas. She would never catch us up. We would build 2 to 1 or more if necessary, and at every stage antagonism would grow between the countries. Radicals and Tories, whatever they might say about each other, were all agreed on that. No British government which jeopardized our naval supremacy could live. He said Mr. Lloyd George had told him very much the same thing, but the Germans had no thought of naval supremacy. All they wanted was a fleet to protect their commerce and their colonies. I asked what was the use of having a weaker fleet. It was only another hostage to fortune. He said that the emperor was profoundly attached to his fleet, and that it was his own creation. I could not resist saying that Moltke had pronounced a very different opinion of Germany's true interests. I have recorded these notes of a pleasant though careful conversation not because they are of any importance, but because they help to show the different points of view. I learned afterwards that the Chancellor of the Exchequer, in similar circumstances, had spoken more explicitly, saying that he would raise 100 millions in a single year for the British Navy if its supremacy were really challenged. Count Metternich was a very honourable man, serving his master faithfully, but labouring to preserve peace, especially peace between England and Germany. I have heard that on one occasion at Berlin, in a throng of generals and princes, someone had said that the British fleet would one day make a surprise and unprovoked attack upon Germany. Whereupon the ambassador had replied that he had lived in England for nearly 10 years, and he knew that such a thing was absolutely impossible. On this remark being received with obvious incredulity, he had drawn himself up and observed that he made it on the honour of a German officer, and that he would answer for its truth with his honour. This, for a moment, had quelled the company. It is customary for thoughtless people to jeer at the old diplomacy and to pretend that wars arise out of its secret machinations. When one looks at the petty subjects which have led to wars between great countries and to so many disputes, it is easy to be misled in this way. Of course, such small matters are only the symptoms of the dangerous disease and are only important for that reason. Behind them lie the interests, the passions, and the destiny of mighty races of men, and long antagonisms express themselves in trifles. Great commotions, it was said of old, arise out of small things, but not concerning small things. The old diplomacy did its best to render harmless the small things. It could not do more. Nevertheless, a war postponed may be a war averted. Circumstances change, combinations change, new groupings arise, old interests are superseded by new. Many quarrels that might have led to war have been adjusted by the old diplomacy of Europe and have, in Lord Melbourne's phrase, blown over. If the nations of the world, while the sense of their awful experiences is still fresh upon them, are able to devise broader and deeper guarantees of peace and build their houses on a surer foundation of brotherhood and independence, they will still require the courtly manners, the polite and measured phrases, the imperturbable demeanour, the secrecy and discretion of the old diplomatists of Europe. This is, however, a digression. On August 23, after Parliament had risen and ministers had dispersed, the Prime Minister convened very secretly a special meeting of the Committee of Imperial Defence. He summoned the ministers specially concerned with the foreign situation and with the fighting services, including, of course, the Chancellor of the Exchequer. There were also the principal officers of the Army and the Navy. I was invited to attend, though the Home Office was not directly concerned. We sat all day. In the morning the Army told its tale. In the afternoon the Navy. General Wilson, as Director of Military Operations, stated the views of the General Staff. Standing by his enormous map, specially transported for the purpose, he unfolded, with what proved afterwards to be extreme accuracy, the German plan for attacking France in the event of a war between Germany and Austria on the one hand and France and Russia on the other. It was briefly as follows. In the first place, the Germans would turn nearly 4/5 of their strength against France and leave only 1/5 to contain Russia. The German armies would draw up on a line from the Swiss frontier to Aix-la-Chapelle. They would then swing their right wing through Belgium, thus turning the line of fortresses by which the eastern frontiers of France were protected. This enormous swing movement of the German right arm would require every road which led through Belgium from Luxembourg to the Belgian Meuse. There were 15 of these roads, and 3 divisions would probably march along each. The Belgian Meuse flowed parallel to the march of these divisions and protected their right flank. Along this river were 3 important fortified passages or bridgeheads. First, nearest Germany, Liege, the last nearest France, Namur, and midway between the two, the fort of Huy. Now arose a question. Would the Germans, after seizing these bridgeheads, confine themselves to the eastern side of the Belgian Meuse and use the river for their protection, or would they be able to spare and bring a large body of troops to prolong their turning movement west of the Belgian Meuse and thus advance beyond it instead of inside it? This was the only part of their plan which could not be foreseen. Would they avoid the west side of the Belgian Meuse altogether? Would they skim along it with a cavalry force only, or would they march infantry divisions or even army corps west of that river? When the time came, as we now know, they marched 2 whole armies. At that date, however, the most sombre apprehension did not exceed 1, or at the outside 2 army corps. Overwhelming detailed evidence was adduced to show that the Germans had made every preparation for marching through Belgium. The great military camps in close proximity to the frontier, the enormous depots, the reticulation of railways, the endless sidings, revealed with the utmost clearness and beyond all doubt their design. Liege would be taken within a few hours of the declaration of war, possibly even before it, by a rush of motor cars and cyclists from the camp at Elsenborn. The camp was now, August 1911, crowded with troops, and inquisitive persons and ordinary country folk were already being roughly turned back and prevented from approaching it. What would Belgium do in the face of such an onslaught? Nothing could save Liege, but French troops might reach Namur in time to aid in its defense. For the rest of the Belgian army, assuming that Belgium resisted the invader, would withdraw into the great entrenched camp and fortress of Antwerp. This extensive area, intersected by a tangle of rivers and canals and defended by 3 circles of force, would become the last refuge of the Belgian monarchy and people. The position of Holland was also examined. It was not thought that the Germans would overrun Holland as they would Belgium, but they might find it very convenient to march across the curiously shaped projection of Holland which lay between Germany and Belgium, and which, in the British General Staff parlance of that time, was called the Maastricht Appendix. They would certainly do this if any considerable body of their troops was thrown west of the Belgian Meuse. The French plans for meeting this formidable situation were not told in detail to us, but it was clear that they hoped to forestall and rupture the German enveloping movement by a counter-offensive of their own on the greatest scale. The number of divisions available on both sides and on all fronts when mobilization was completed were estimated as follows: French 85, German 110. It was asserted that if 6 British divisions were sent to take position on the extreme French left, immediately war was declared, the chances of repulsing the Germans in the first great shock of battle were favorable. Every French soldier would fight with double confidence if he knew he was not fighting alone. Upon the strength of Russia, General Wilson spoke with great foresight, and the account which he gave of the slow mobilization of the Russian army swept away many illusions. It seemed incredible that Germany should be content to leave scarcely a score of divisions to make head against the might of Russia. But the British General Staff considered that such a decision would be well founded. We shall see presently how the royalty of Russia and the Tsar found the means by prodigious sacrifices to call back to the east vital portions of the German army at the supreme moment. Such action could not be foreseen then, and most people have forgotten it now. There was of course a considerable discussion and much questioning before we adjourned at 2 o'clock. When we began again at 3, it was the turn of the Admiralty, and the First Sea Lord, Sir Arthur Wilson, with another map expounded his views of the policy we should pursue in the event of our being involved in such a war. He did not reveal the Admiralty war plans. Those he kept locked away in his own brain, but he indicated that they embodied the principle of a close blockade of the enemy's ports. It was very soon apparent that a profound difference existed between the War Office and the Admiralty view. In the main, the Admiralty thought that we should confine our efforts to the sea, that if our small army were sent to the continent, it would be swallowed up among the immense hosts conflicting there, whereas if kept in ships or ready to embark for counterstrokes upon the German coast, it would draw off more than its own weight of numbers from the German fighting line. This view, which was violently combated by the generals, did not commend itself to the bulk of those present, and on many points of detail connected with the landings of these troops, the military and naval authorities were found in complete discord. The serious disagreement between the military and naval staffs in such critical times upon fundamental issues was the immediate cause of my going to the Admiralty. After the council had separated, Mr. Haldane intimated to the Prime Minister that he would not continue to be responsible for the War Office unless a board of Admiralty was called into being which would work in full harmony with the War Office plans, and would begin the organization of a proper naval war staff. Of course I knew nothing of this, but it was destined soon to affect my fortunes in a definite manner. I thought that the General Staff took too sanguine a view of the French army. Knowing their partisanship for France, I feared the wish was father to the thought. It was inevitable that British military men, ardently desirous of seeing their country intervene on the side of France, and convinced that the destruction of France by Germany would imperil the whole future of Great Britain, should be inclined to overrate their relative power of the French army and accord it brighter prospects than were actually justified. The bulk of their information was derived from French sources. The French General Staff were resolute and hopeful. The principle of the offensive was the foundation of their military art and the mainspring of the French soldier. Although, according to the best information, the French pre-war army, when fully mobilized, was only 3/4 as strong as the German pre-war army. The French mobilization from the 9th to the 13th day yielded a superior strength on the fighting front. High hopes were entertained by the French generals that a daring seizure of the initiative and a vigorous offensive into Alsace-Lorraine would have the effect of rupturing the carefully thought-out German plans of marching through Belgium on to Paris. These hopes were reflected in the British General Staff appreciations. I could not share them. I had therefore prepared a memorandum for the Committee of Imperial Defense, which embodied my own conclusions upon all I had learned from the General Staff. It was dated August 13, 1911. It was, of course, only an attempt to pierce the veil of the future, to conjure up in the mind a vast imaginary situation, to balance the incalculable, to weigh the imponderable. It will be seen that I named the 20th day of mobilization as the date by which the French armies will have been driven from the line of the Meuse and will be falling back on Paris and the south, and the 40th day as that by which Germany should be extended at full strain both internally and on her war fronts, and that opportunities for the decisive trial of strength may then occur. I am quite free to admit that these were not intended to be precise dates, but as guides to show what would probably happen. In fact, however, both these forecasts were almost literally verified 3 years later by the event. I reprinted this memorandum on the 2nd of September 1914 in order to encourage my colleagues with the hope that if the unfavorable prediction about the 20th day had been borne out, so also would be the favorable prediction about the 40th day. And so indeed it was. Military aspects of the continental problem. Memorandum by Mr. Churchill, August 13, 1911. The following notes have been written on the assumption that a decision has been arrived at to employ a British military force on the continent of Europe. It does not prejudge that decision in any way. It is assumed that an alliance exists between Great Britain, France, and Russia, and that these powers are attacked by Germany and Austria. First, the decisive military operations will be those between France and Germany. The German army is at least equal in quality to the French and mobilizes 2,200,000 against 1,700,000. The French must therefore seek for a situation of more equality. This can be found either before the full strength of the Germans has been brought to bear or after the German army has become extended. The first might be reached between the 9th and 13th day, the latter about the 40th. Second, the fact that during a few days in the mobilization period the French are equal or temporarily superior on the frontiers is of no significance, except on the assumption that France contemplates adopting strategic offensive. The Germans will not choose the days when they themselves have least superiority for a general advance, and if the French advance, they lose at once all the advantages of their own internal communications, and by moving towards the advancing German reinforcements, annul any numerical advantage they may for the moment possess. The French have therefore, at the beginning of the war, no option but to remain on the defensive, both upon their own fortress line and behind the Belgian frontier, and the choice of the day when the first main collision will commence rests with the Germans, who must be credited with the wisdom of choosing the best possible day, and cannot be forced into decisive action against their will, except by some reckless and unjustifiable movement on the part of the French. Third, a prudent survey of chances from the British point of view ought to contemplate that, when the German advance decisively begins, it will be backed by sufficient preponderance of force, and developed on a sufficiently wide front to compel the French armies to retreat from their positions behind the Belgian frontier, even though they may hold the gaps between the fortresses on the Verdun-Belfort front. No doubt a series of great battles will have been fought with varying local fortunes, and there is always a possibility of a heavy German check. But even if the Germans were brought to a standstill, the French would not be strong enough to advance in their turn, and in any case we ought not to count on this. The balance of probability is that by the 20th day the French armies will have been driven from the line of the Meuse, and will be falling back on Paris and the south. All plans based upon the opposite assumption ask too much of fortune. Fourth, This is not to exclude the plan of using 4 or 6 British divisions in these great initial operations. Such a force is a material factor of significance. Its value to the French would be out of all proportions to its numerical strength. It would encourage every French soldier and make the task of the Germans in forcing the frontier much more costly. But the question which is of most practical consequence to us is what is to happen after the frontier has been forced and the invasion of France has begun. France will not be able to end the war successfully by any action on the frontiers. She will not be strong enough to invade Germany. Her only chance is to conquer Germany in France. It is this problem which should be studied before any final decision is taken. Fifth, the German armies in advancing through Belgium and onwards into France will be relatively weakened by all or any of the following causes: by the greater losses incidental to the offensive, especially if they have tested unsuccessfully the French fortress lines; by the greater employment of soldiers necessitated by acting on exterior lines; by having to guard their communications through Belgium and France, especially from the sea flank; by having to invest Paris, requiring at least 500,000 men against 100,000, and to besiege or mask other places, especially along the seaboard; by the arrival of the British army; by the growing pressure of Russia from the 30th day, and generally by the bad strategic situation to which their right-handed advance will commit them as it becomes pronounced. All these factors will operate increasingly in proportions as the German advance continues and every day that passes. Sixth, time is also required for the naval blockade to make itself felt on German commerce, industry, and food prices, as described in the Admiralty Memorandum, and for these again to react to German credit and finances already burdened with the prodigious daily cost of the war. All these pressures will develop simultaneously and progressively. The Chancellor of the Exchequer has drawn special attention to this and to the very light structure of German industry and economic organizations. Seventh, by the 40th day, Germany should be extended at full strain both internally and on her war fronts, and this strain will become daily more severe and ultimately overwhelming, unless it is relieved by decisive victories in France. If the French army has not been squandered by precipitate or desperate action, the balance of forces should be favorable after the 40th day, and will improve steadily as time passes. For the German armies will be confronted with a situation which combines an ever-growing need for a successful offensive, with a battlefront which tends continually towards numerical equality. Opportunities for the decisive trial of strength may then occur. Eighth, such a policy demands heavy and hard sacrifices from France, who must with great constancy expose herself to invasion, to having her provinces occupied by the enemy, and to the investment of Paris, and whose armies may be committed to retrograde or defensive operations. Whether her rulers could contemplate or her soldiers endure this trial may depend upon the military support which Great Britain can give, and this must be known beforehand, so that the French war plans can be adjusted accordingly, and so that we may know before we decide what they would be prepared to do. Ninth, the following measures would appear to be required to enable Great Britain to take an effective part in the decisive theatre of war. The 4 divisions of the Expeditionary Army with their auxiliary troops should be sent on the outbreak of war to France, about 107,000 men. To these should be added the 2 remaining divisions as soon as the naval blockade is effectively established, about 53,000 men. and the 7th Division from South Africa and the Mediterranean as soon as the colonial forces in South Africa can be embodied, about 15,000 men, and 5,000 additional yeomanry cavalry or light horse with 10,000 volunteer cyclists territorials. As we should be allies of Russia, the Anglo-Indian Army could be drawn upon so long as 2 native regiments were moved out of India for every British regiment. Lord Kitchener has stated that it would be possible in so grave a need to withdraw 6 out of the 9 field divisions from India, and this should be done immediately. This force could be brought into France by Marseille by the 40th day, about 100,000 men, thus making a total force of 290,000 men. This fine army, almost entirely composed of professional soldiers, could be assembled around, say, Tours for the 40th day, in rear of the French left, instead of being frittered into action piecemeal, and would then become a very important factor in events. The Russian army would also by then be engaged in full force on the eastern frontiers of Germany and Austria, and the power of the 3 allies should then be sufficient either to hold the Germans in a position of growing difficulty or desirable to assume the offensive in concert. 10th. To provide meanwhile for the security of Great Britain, for unforeseeable contingencies, and for sustaining the expeditionary army with a continuous supply of volunteer drafts, it would be necessary on the outbreak, a. to embody the whole territorial force, b. to call for volunteers for home defense from all persons possessing military experience, c. to raise a compulsory levy of 500,000 men for home defense. This levy should be formed upon the cadres of the territorial divisions so as to enable a proportion of the territorial army to be released at the end of the 6th month. The question of sending any part of the compulsory levy by compulsion to the continent would not arise until after this force had been trained. The steady augmentation of British military strength during the progress of the war would, however, put us in a position by the end of the 12th month to secure or re-establish British interests outside Europe, even if, through the defeat or desertion of allies, we were forced to continue the war alone. No lesser steps would seem adequate to the scale of events. Winston S. Churchill. The conference separated. Apprehension lay heavy on the minds of all who had participated in it. The War Office hummed with secrets in those days. Not the slightest overt action could be taken, but every preparation by forethought was made and every detail was worked out on paper. The railway timetables, the graphics, as they were called, of the movements of every battalion, even where they were to drink their coffee, were prepared and settled. Thousands of maps of northern France and Belgium were printed. The cavalry maneuvers were postponed on account of the scarcity of water in Wiltshire and the neighboring counties. The press, fiercely divided on party lines, overwhelmingly pacific in tendency, without censorship, without compulsion, observed a steady universal reticence. Not a word broke the long-drawn oppressive silence. The great railway strike came to an end with mysterious suddenness. Mutual concessions were made by masters and men after hearing a confidential statement from the Chancellor of the Exchequer. In the middle of August I went to the country for a few days. I could not think of anything else but the peril of war. I did my other work as it came along, but there was only one field of interest fiercely illuminated in my mind. Sitting on a hilltop in the smiling country which stretches around Mells, the lines I have copied at the top of this chapter kept running through my mind. Whenever I recall them, they bring back to me the anxieties of those Agadir days. From Mells I wrote the following letter to Sir Edward Grey. It speaks for itself. Mr. Churchill to Sir Edward Grey, 30th of August 1911. Perhaps the time is coming when decisive action will be necessary. Please consider the following policy for use if and when the Morocco negotiations fail. Propose to France and Russia a triple alliance to safeguard, inter alia, the independence of Belgium, Holland, and Denmark. Tell Belgium that, if her neutrality is violated, we are prepared to come to her aid and to make an alliance with France and Russia to guarantee her independence. Tell her that we will take whatever military steps will be most effective for that purpose. But the Belgian army must take the field in concert with the British and French armies, and Belgium must immediately garrison properly Liège and Namur. Otherwise, we cannot be responsible for her fate. Offer the same guarantee both to Holland and to Denmark, contingent upon their making their utmost exertions. We should, if necessary, aid Belgium to defend Antwerp and to feed that fortress and any army based on it. We should be prepared at the proper moment to put extreme pressure on the Dutch to keep the Scheldt open for all purposes. If the Dutch closed the Scheldt, we should retaliate by a blockade of the Rhine. It is very important to us to be able to blockade the Rhine, and it gets more important as the war goes on. On the other hand, if the Germans do not use the Maastricht Appendix in the first days of the war, they will not want it at all. Let me add that I am not at all convinced about the wisdom of a close blockade, and I did not like the Admiralty statement. If the French send cruisers to Mogador and Safi, I am of opinion that we should, for our part, move our main fleet to the north of Scotland into its war station. Our interests are European and not Moroccan. The significance of the movement would be just as great as if we sent our 2 ships with the French. Please let me know when you will be in London, and will you kindly send this letter on to the Prime Minister. My views underwent no change in the 3 years of peace that followed. On the contrary, they were confirmed and amplified by everything I learned. In some respects, as in the abolition of the plan of close blockade and the sending of the fleet to its war station, I was able to carry them out. In other cases, such as the defense of Antwerp, I had not the power to do in time what I believed to be equally necessary. But I tried my best, not as frequently being proclaimed upon a foolish impulse, but in pursuance of convictions reached by pondering and study. I could not help feeling a strong confidence in the truth of these convictions, but I saw how several of them were justified, one after the other, in that terrible and unparalleled period of convulsion. I had no doubts whatever what ought to be done in certain matters, and my only difficulty was to persuade or induce others. The Agadir crisis came, however, peacefully to an end. It terminated in the diplomatic rebuff of Germany. Once more she had disturbed all Europe by a sudden and menacing gesture. Once more she had used the harshest threats towards France. For the first time she had made British statesmen feel that sense of direct contact with the war peril which was never absent from continental minds. The French, however, offered concessions and compensations. An intricate negotiation about the frontiers of French and German territory in West Africa, in which the Baie de Cana played an important part, had resulted in an agreement between the two principals. To us it seemed that France had won a considerable advantage. She was not, however, particularly pleased. Her Prime Minister, Monsieur Caillot, who had presided during those anxious days, was dismissed from office on grounds which at the time it was very difficult to appreciate here, but which, viewed in the light of subsequent events, can more easily be understood. The tension in German governing circles must have been very great. The German colonial secretary, von Lindequist, resigned rather than sign the agreement. There is no doubt that deep and violent passions of humiliation and resentment were coursing beneath the glittering uniforms which thronged the palaces through which the Kaiser moved. And of those passions the Crown Prince made himself the exponent. The world had heaped unbounded execrations upon this unlucky being. He was probably in fact no better and no worse than the average young cavalry subaltern who had not been through the ordinary mill at a public school, nor had to think about earning his living. He had a considerable personal charm, which he lavished principally upon the fair sex, but which in darker days has captivated the juvenile population of Wieringen. This flattered head was turned by the burning eyes of guttural words of great captains and statesmen and party leaders. He therefore threw himself forward into this strong favoring current and became a power, or rather the focus of a power, with which the Kaiser was forced to reckon. Germany once more proceeded to increase her armaments by land and sea. It was a question, writes Tirpitz in his Memoirs, Volume 1, page 191, of our keeping our nerve, continuing to arm on a grand scale, avoiding all provocation, and waiting without anxiety until our sea power was established, and forced the English to let us breathe in peace. Only to breathe in peace. What fearful apparatus was required to secure this simple act of respiration? Early in October, Mr. Asquith invited me to stay with him in Scotland. The day after I had arrived there, on our way home from the links, he asked me quite abruptly whether I would like to go to the Admiralty. He had put the same question to me when he first became Prime Minister. This time I had no doubt what to answer. All my mind was full of the dangers of war. I accepted the alacrity. I said, indeed I would. He said that Mr. Haldane was coming to see him the next day, and we would talk it over together. But I saw that his mind was made up. The fading light of evening disclosed in the far distance the silhouettes of two battleships steaming slowly out of the Firth of Forth. They seemed invested with a new significance to me. That night, when I went to bed, I saw a large Bible lying on the table in my bedroom. My mind was dominated by the news I had received of the complete change in my station and of the task entrusted to me. I thought of the peril of Britain, peace-loving, unthinking, little prepared of her power and virtue, and of her mission of good sense and fair play. I thought of mighty Germany, towering up in the splendor of her imperial state and delving down in her profound, cold, patient, ruthless calculations. I thought of the army corps I had watched tramp past, wave after wave of valiant manhood, at the Breslau manoeuvres in 1907. Of the thousands of strong horses dragging cannon and great howitzers up the ridges and along the roads around Würzburg in 1910. I thought of German education and thoroughness and all that their triumphs in science and philosophy implied. I thought of the sudden and successful wars by which her power had been set up. I opened the book at random, and in the 9th chapter of Deuteronomy I read, "Hear, O Israel, thou art to pass over Jordan this day, to go in to possess nations greater and mightier than thyself, cities great and fenced up to heaven. a people great and tall, the children of the Anakims, who thou knowest, and who thou hast heard say, who can stand before the children of Anak? Understand therefore this day, that the Lord thy God is he which goeth over before thee. As a consuming fire he shall destroy them, and he shall bring them down before thy face. So shalt thou drive them out, and destroy them quickly, as the Lord hath said unto thee. Speak not thou in thine heart, after that the Lord thy God hath cast over them out from before thee, saying, For my righteousness the Lord hath brought me in to possess this land. But for the wickedness of these nations the Lord doth drive them out from before thee. Not for thy righteousness, or for thy uprightness of thine heart, dost thou go to possess their land, but for the wickedness of these nations the Lord thy God doth drive them out from before thee, and that he may perform the word which the Lord sware unto thy fathers. And that he may perform the word which the Lord sware unto thy fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It seemed a message full of reassurance.